My name is Kelly Hood. I'm a cybersecurity engineer with Optic Cyber Solutions. And
I'm Greg Witt. I am with Paladin, but I am a supporter for Optic Cyber Solutions. I'm also very fortunate in that I got one of the best jobs in the world. I'm a part-time associate researcher at NIST. So while I can't speak for them, I'm not a government employee, but I work with them every day. So I get the chance to work on many of these things, of course, including the cybersecurity framework. So I get to work on these frameworks part of the time, and I get to work with teams like Kelly and her colleague Tom all the time in implementing them. So I get to see the best of both.
Right. So thank you all for joining us today. We're here with CForum, which is a community organization that tries to bring people together to have a conversation about cybersecurity. And specifically, it was created about 10 years ago, whenever the NIST Cybersecurity Framework was originally released back in 2014. So we're excited for the opportunity to continue the conversation as we move into version 2.0 with some of the updates that were just released even Monday of this week. So we hope to continue the conversation there at CForum, but we're going to kick that off now.
Sounds good. Lead the way.
Okay. So we will start off with our disclaimer here. I'm sure you've seen this a few times already this week, but just that these presentations are intended for educational purposes and are our thoughts alone. So just to make sure everybody's in the right room, we are here to talk about the cybersecurity framework. As I mentioned, right now we are in the middle of the process of the journey to 2.0. And actually, I'm curious, as we get started here, I know earlier there was a session put on by NIST with Sherry and Amy, and I was curious who all has already been to that session today, just to kind of judge on, I can see, so yeah, I hope you were there. Wonderful. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a mix, some people that were there and some people that haven't. So that helps us know where to move forward. Yeah. So with that, knowing that there was a preliminary draft of the core released Monday, the target we're really looking at for 2.0 is winter 2024. So just as that landmark out there, that is the goal that is being worked on right now. And here's a little bit more detail. You can see the process that has been undergone so far. I'm really kicking off back in February of 2022. I think NIST does a really great job of really getting community engagement and trying to ask for what is working and what is not working with all of their standards, but specifically around the cybersecurity framework. And we can see that process here. So as I mentioned, kind of on the right third of that line graph right now, we're moving towards that way. With the core draft that was released on Monday, and then we can expect the preliminary draft of the entire document out this summer, ultimately shooting to winter 2024 again. So one of the key points that was driving the update was don't fix what's not broken. The cybersecurity framework is used by a lot of different organizations in a lot of ways. And that flexibility and that common language is one of the things that I think a lot of organizations, specifically that I've worked with and along with Greg, that we've seen be really successful. And so that is one of I know the guiding constructs is we're not trying to break anything here. We want to just improve. The world has changed over the last 10 years, and how do we do that? And specifically around some additional guidance. So we are going to get into some of the details of the core update, the proposed updates that were released on Monday later in the presentation. But we wanted to start off by just kind of sharing some of the guidance that we have seen that have come out over the last 10 years, specifically, to help with the implementation of the framework. So some of the things we're going to talk about before we get into the core are talking about the guidance that is already out there available. So if you're anybody that is using the framework or looking to start implementing it and looking for help in doing that, we will hopefully have some suggestions for you. Also, some of the points we're going to talk through that with some of the drivers going into the update process is about keeping the core flexible and tailorable. Don't forget about governance, so we'll talk a lot about that, expanding supply chain risk management, and then also, how do I measure this?
Yeah, that's always been a challenge. In fact, Kelly and I had the opportunity to implement this framework along with the CMMI Institute. So we've had some direct experience in understanding how would I measure, there's so much in here that's difficult to measure. So how can you measure it? And it's not just kind of in a binary way, but how can you measure an organization's improvement along a projection on getting there? So that's been really interesting.
So as a quick refresher, and we'll run through this very quick, we wanted to just kind of level set on the language of the framework. For anybody that is not familiar with it, the cybersecurity framework has 3 components: the core, the profiles, and the tiers. And the core is what we will be spending most of the time today talking about, especially since that was what was the update for the week. But the core is a set of common cybersecurity outcomes. So these are those goals that we're trying to achieve. They're not specific, regulatory requirements. NIST isn't a regulatory body. So just wanted to level set that these are those outcomes that we are striving to achieve when we are talking about a cybersecurity program. And then we can see here the current version of the core in version 1.1 that we will also dig into more. We had some fun this week updating our slides as we saw the updates that came out. We also have the tiers, which speak to that measurement point. Currently in the document, there are 4 implementation tiers, so not quite a maturity model, but something to help guide a way that you are managing risk in your organization, to help have that conversation across the organization, as well as up with leadership and with your implementers on what types of capabilities are we looking to implement. When we're talking about access control, are we okay with a bike lock on the door that sometimes we remember to lock, or we really need more sophisticated processes and PIN readers and badge scanners and things like that? And we can have that conversation around the tiers.
Yeah, one of the key drivers, ever since the very first public workshop that NIST held up in Pittsburgh in 2013, the thing we heard very frequently was that there's a lot of organizations that have a risk management program, but they don't necessarily integrate that into the day-to-day activities. Risk is something that someone else does. And at the time, it was a bigger issue. I think the community has made a lot of progress on integrating those pieces. But even today, as we look at what those tiers represent, they're an opportunity to think about, do we have a formalized risk management process? Have we built that? Have we baked that into what we do in every part of what we do? And then to what extent are we sharing information? So those are part of the tiers, and that's part of what NIST is going to be building on with this next iteration.
And that brings us to the third component with the profiles. And this is where the profile is really a way to capture what you're doing in your cybersecurity program. And we've seen this done in many, many different ways across different organizations. And NIST also has a bunch of resources on their website documenting the ways that this can be done. So if you're looking for help with profiles and how to capture this information and how to talk about it within your company, profiles are a great way to do that, and there are a lot of resources available. I do want to also make a point here that there's this concept of current state and target state, that as you're using the framework, we found it really helpful to leverage that current and target state profile so you can define not only what you're doing today, but what you want to do in the future, back to having that risk conversation and having that drive towards where you're headed to define that and make sure you're all working towards the same goals. And that can be done through those profiles.
Yep.
Okay, now that we all understand what the cybersecurity framework is and those 3 components, we will move on to some of the resources. So one of the things that, like we mentioned, with this update process, the goal is to not break what's not broken. But some guidance would be help, and that was one of the things that was heard loud and clear is more guidance, please. And so we wanted to highlight some of the resources that are already out there available today.
Yeah. One of the challenges that we heard frequently, when NIST puts out a PDF with references that are helpful and they provide guidance and examples, almost as soon as that PDF is written, those standards are changing. Of course, when you're pointing to a community that's in constant change, and as it should be, it gets very difficult to point to references, especially if you're going to instantiate them in a PDF. So what NIST has been working on for quite a while is trying to find a way, how could we take those references and move them into an online format? Something that you could download this morning. Yes, the CSF draft core was released on Monday. On Tuesday, you could have references that are updated. So by creating some sort of an online informative reference guide, some catalog of those pieces, you could use automated tools that could express those in different ways, like XML, so that you can immediately say, what does this mean? What does this mean for us? For example, I know that NIST heard from many individual sectors of the community. There's no way that the CSF core could have included references from every type of sector, and yet with an informative reference program, you could. You could say, go here for informative references related to water, look here for power, look here for retail. We can do different sectors, different communities, small business, whatever we want to do, if we had an unlimited set of references, rather than trying to squish it all into the rightmost column of a PDF file. So NIST has been working hard on building an online edition of that reference column. We've also been looking to create, and they've already created the beginnings of, what NIST calls the Cybersecurity and Privacy reference tool, the CPRT. And the CPRT expands on that notion. How could we take, for so many years, many of us have relied on these great PDF files that give a lot of great written guidance, but much of what we do is using automation. Much of what we do is interpreting those different pieces, taking the controls in the 800-53 catalog, interpreting that through whatever assessment processes we have, using that to think about what our tools are scanning for within our own systems. So NIST is building this capability, which basically expresses these different documents in things like XML and JSON. It's the same things we've always loved. In fact, if you go today and you download the NIST Security and Privacy Control Catalog in a special publication 800-53, it was actually generated from XML. It wasn't someone typing in a Word file. It was generated through XML. The same thing is true for the assessment criteria. So NIST has been working hard. We've heard from the community to say, we want to take these things that people have come to rely upon and convert them into a machine-readable piece that can be transformed into prose, but is machine-readable. And we can use tools like NIST's open source control assessment language, OSCAL, to be able to interpret those things, that XML, those data points, to be able to do more automation, and most importantly, keep them up to date. As those reference points change, we can keep those up to date day by day as those get updated.
Right. That's often the hardest part. So we wanted to make sure to take a moment to talk through what's out there. So again, tell your friends if anybody is looking for that help. NIST is always asking for more materials if you guys have them, if you've implemented the cybersecurity framework, but there is already a wealth of information out there through the online informative references, the CPRT, even success stories. I know I talked about this morning a little bit and how organizations have successfully implemented it. So there's a lot of information out there. And also, I guess, to talk about CFORM again for just a moment, having that community group, it's one place that we like to bring people together to be able to ask questions. If you don't understand how to implement something or want to know if an organization similar to yours has used the framework in a particular way around measurement or a specific technology, it can be a really great place to do that as well.
Yeah, in one of the recent NIST workshops, we held some conversations in Slack, and it was a brief workshop where people were saying, man, I wish this conversation is great. I wish it could continue somehow. And those of us that helped to form CFORM said, it's been there for 10 years and it can go on forever. We can keep this conversation going forever. So that might be an opportunity to continue dialogue as we consider this new core draft and the changes to it, the updates, how we apply it and make it practical. That's a great place to continue the conversation. And we'll provide the link before we finish.
We will have a link to all of the references in the slides. So one of the next points that that the community made loud and clear coming into the update process was keep the core flexible and tailorable. Like we had talked, many different organizations of many different sizes and sectors and shapes and colors and all things are using the framework in many different ways. And that was one of the things that I think NIST has talked about wanting to keep consistent. They don't want to break it for anybody. They want people to be able to use it in a way that makes sense for them. Whether you're using the 5 or now 6 functions as just a communication tool or going all the way down to the subcategories, the framework is there to be a tool and a framework, not a compliance or regulatory standard, but to use it how it makes sense and helps you improve your cybersecurity program. To that point, there were some other comments about how there was some confusing and unclear language in certain subcategories. And so that was another thing that being able to clarify that was one of the additional drivers. Oh, doesn't look like it's coming in. That was odd. So, and then back to just keeping it flexible for organizations of all sizes. The framework will also continue to be vendor agnostic and outcome based.
One of the things that we talked about in the initial edition of CSF, and I think it will carry through, it's clear from the draft that it will, is to keep these subcategories outcome focused. Functions categories and subcategories are all talking about the outcome you want to achieve. In many of the standards you can look at, it says you should do something or do something. It was activity based. And one of the things that we heard as we were working in the initial 1.x rounds was, don't tell me what to do, tell me what we're trying to achieve. Let me decide how we'll achieve it. Let's use the CSF to be an understanding of the objectives. What are we trying to achieve through whatever it is that we do? So I love that the CSF is outcome focused. So you'll see that continues in the new draft, that they are all about objectives and outcomes to be achieved, not necessarily ways to achieve it, although NIST will provide additional guidance on how one might do that as an opportunity, as something to think about.
Which brings us to our next point about governance.
Yeah.
One of the other key topics that was brought up in the comment period and the request for information was about governance and how previously it was included in the identify function as a category, but a lot of people were saying, hey, we want more, we need to build this out and have a bigger conversation around it. And so governance actually is being moved into its own function, and we'll definitely get into that a little bit more later. But that was one of the big things to highlight that difference between management and implementation and really create a stronger focus on governance.
Yeah, one of the things, I'm also fortunate to work with ISACA, who through their COBIT model and other pieces, they've had a practice for a long time of separating governance from management. And it became clear as we implemented the framework and as others did, many of us recognized that it would be even better if we could take these important governed pieces and make them stand on their own as a support structure for all the great things that we'll do to manage the risk and the processes.
Right. Which brings us to our next graphic. If you were a part of one of the workshop back in February, there was a lot of conversation about how governance should be broken out. Do we leave the framework as the 5 functions that it was previously, the identify, protect, detect, respond, or recover, or do we build out governance to be the chocolatey coating around everything we do? And we can now see, based on the update that was released on Monday, that we are in fact moving in the direction of our chocolatey governance coating.
I love me a Thin Mint, obviously. So, yeah.
So one of the other topics that was a key point was around supply chain risk management. Obviously, that's a big topic here at the conference, even around managing our suppliers, understanding our risk. What are we getting from them? What are they getting from us? How do we protect our data, our systems? And that was something that was heard loud and clear. So there were some categories that were moved around and some subcategories, and we'll get into that. But we also wanted to point out to a resource that's already available. Again, we were hoping this session to really bring you tools that are available for you today to walk away with. And it's NIST SP 800-161, all on cyber supply chain risk management. It's a great document full of a lot of different considerations and ways to look at your supply chain and evaluate the risk that they bring to you, as well as that you potentially bring to them.
Yeah, and it's a reminder, as we see, so much of what we do today is outsourced and depending on our partners. So it's an opportunity to remember that so many of the outcomes in that cyber framework core they include our cyber supply chain partners. So while there are some things we need to do to make sure we've got an effective cyber supply chain risk management program, there's also many things we do throughout the other outcomes that support all of the things we need for supply chain. So it's an opportunity to make sure we've got an effective program, but to still bake it in with all the other outcomes that we do.
Right. And measurement. So how do we measure this? We've talked a lot about the core and the outcomes and suppliers. How do we measure if what we're doing is enough? How do we know if we're protecting our data, our assets, what's important to us? And that's been a big conversation, I know, about how to address this. Do we update the tiers? Does that need to change? Do we build out a maturity model? And right now, it looks like we're going to keep the tiers because that is something we're seeing be effective with organizations and being that communication tool around targeting a tier 3 or a 4 and being defining those risk-based capabilities and processes. But one of the things we wanted to highlight is that figuring out what we need to measure and what's important to measure is also important, whether it's number of incidents, patches, downtime, how many spam emails you're getting. Having conversations about that is really going to help you drive knowing how to measure it appropriately. If we don't understand what we care about, we can't figure out how to measure that appropriately. And there is a publication out already, again, for resources in the meantime, NIST SB 855, that's already out there and talks a lot about performance measurement and goals.
Draft.
A draft, good point. But the draft is available for everybody if you want to take a look at that and get some pointers on things to consider as you start looking at measuring your cybersecurity capabilities. Okay, now 2.0. Or the details. So we were able to take a few minutes this week after we saw that the update was published, and we built in a few slides. So we wanted to do a brief overview of the core discussion draft that was just released. So we're going to start off with a really high-level overview and then walk through how some of the categories and subcategories shifted around, and then we'll actually pull up the PDF at the end, and we'll use our remaining time to kind of walk through some key points in that document. But as I think Sherry had mentioned this morning, it's also a great resource to read on the plane on the way home. So definitely dig in. We'll touch the highlights today, but there's a lot of information there. So starting off, we can see the biggest change is going from 5 functions to 6 functions, and we talked about governance and how that was such an important topic that was being asked about. So that was broken out. Where previously it was included and identified as a category, we now have a whole function talking about that. And then also with the categories, as things have shifted around, we've gone from 23 categories to a proposed 21, and then 108 subcategories to 112. So if you're doing CSF by numbers, here's your slide.
Yeah. And for the most part, when people have asked me, what is changing? I think at least from what we're seeing from the draft now, to a large extent, it's not going to, we said do no harm. We're not seeing much of a change in a process side. There's a lot that's changing within the core as far as clarity and detail, but the general process is the same. The approach is going to be fairly similar to what we've been using for a decade. It has been proven successful. I know that Optic has used it in dozens of places where we've applied this framework in some of the largest corporations in the world and some of the smallest that you'd ever meet. So it's an amazing framework that's actually very flexible and agile. So we wanted to make sure it didn't get broken, and yet there clearly were updates that we needed to make after so many years as it got old and gray like me.
Okay, so one of the first areas we wanted to highlight here is what's changing or what's moving. So I've highlighted in yellow on the slide here all of the categories that are being realigned or removed. And it doesn't mean that they're being gone forever. The concepts are largely still there, as Greg was saying, do no harm. But if you're looking for these words, if you're already using the framework and you have policies or capabilities or presentations built around this is language that you'll see that's changing. So that's everything from business environment, governance, as we saw being moved up, identity management, access control, all the way down to maintenance, protective technologies, and so on. But there are 10 categories that are actually being realigned and removed.
Yeah. One of the misconceptions, I would say, when the cybersecurity framework first came out, in fact, it was in the title, it was very focused in some ways on critical infrastructure. And I heard many organizations said that they didn't believe the cyber framework was something that would help them because they're not, they didn't consider themselves critical infrastructure. This framework has always been usable by anybody and useful for anybody. But in this round, NIST changed the name so that it doesn't even, critical infrastructure isn't even in the title of the document anymore, just to reinforce the fact that this is usable by anybody, small or large, whatever your industry sector. And I think some of the clarifications that NIST has made in renaming, rewording, has also helped to drive that home. That this, when we're thinking about what types of technology, whether it's IT, OT, IoT, IOMT, MOUSE, whatever we're securing, it's included. Whoever we're working with, they're included. So we've tried to find ways to make it more broad and still stay applicable for everybody. It's kind of a tightrope, isn't it? You don't want to say it does everything for everyone, but it should be broadly applicable, and that was part of the design factors from the beginning. So that's been a little bit of the tightrope, and I think that's probably part of what you'll be providing as feedback back to NIST. Say, well, I think maybe a little too far to the right this side, a little bit far to the left this side, but please do provide feedback to help NIST refine and continue to get it right, because this is used by many people around the world, and these words are read by many of our leaders and managers and risk managers, so it's important that we get it right.
Yeah, completely. And here we can see a brief overview, kind of as Greg said, not to break anything, not to take anything away, but just a quick messy arrow diagram of where everything is moving to. So if you're looking for business environment, we can see that it's getting moved over to operational context. If you're looking for protective technologies, we can see where it's getting moved over into protect. So I found this helpful in having some conversations this week with people of just, but it all looks like it's changing, but it's really there. We're just kind of moving things around.
Yeah, it's all changed and none of it's changed.
Right. But here's where a lot of those areas are moving. So kind of going the other way. As you look at the framework and you're reading it on your flight home, you can take a look and you'll see a lot of new words, like operate or organizational context, for example, and roles and responsibilities and policies and platform security and all of these new things called out. And it's encompassing a lot of the same information, but also highlighting the points that people were having the most questions on. And so if we kind of look at the arrows going both ways, we can see that, went too far. We can see that a lot of the areas that were being removed are actually being realigned into some of these new categories to create clarity and make it more easily understandable what we were kind of shooting for in the beginning, and to address changes that have happened over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we used to tell folks when the CSF first came out, we had broken up, unlike some of the control catalogs, we had taken some of the pieces and kind of spread it out throughout the Corps. So like we said, you should identify the vulnerabilities you face. You should protect against those vulnerabilities. You should detect those vulnerabilities. You should respond to vulnerabilities being exploited. We kind of spread them out. But we heard from the community in the response to the concept paper and other RFI responses that that was confusing and it seemed duplicative. So the NIST team has largely tried to look for opportunities to kind of bundle those things back up. So many of them didn't go away, but you'll see a lot of consolidation, where many of the things that talked about vulnerabilities now live together. Many of the areas of improvement now live together. So they weren't removed, they just now live as a family in one little home. So in that sense, it's less confusing and a little bit less duplicative.
Right. And if you're asking yourself, well, what didn't change? There are still a lot of areas that are largely similar. We can see a lot of the same language across the categories being, maybe moved around a little bit, but there is a lot of consistency back to the things that were working really well for organizations. NIST didn't want to change it and create harm where things were working just fine. So we can see a lot of the similar language and consistency in some of these areas here as well.
Yep.
So in summary, we can see all of the arrows on top that really we're moving as we move from left to right. There's a lot of things shifting, being consolidated, being expanded in other areas to focus on what's really important, what the community's asking for. But there are no arrows that go off the screen. There are no arrows that are really coming in from nowhere. That a lot of times it's that expanding, clarifying, and focusing on what people are really talking about today.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes was in the govern side of things. And again, since I get to work with many of the organizations that are building in a governance, not government, governance aspect, I think this gives us the opportunity to reach out to our leadership and kind of ask a few more questions about what they expect. That was always part of CSF, but in many cases, the leaders would say, interesting, okay, hand it to the CISO and say, let me know how that goes. By adding this govern piece, it helps to drive a little bit more interaction from leadership. It's a place where we can say, what are we really trying to accomplish as an organization? What's our mission? What's our vision for the organization? Because that vision, the objectives that come out of that mission are what causes us risk. So how do we take what we know about the organization's mission, use that to figure out our objectives and requirements, and then we can use that to think about, well, then how are we going to assign those responsibilities for those requirements to the right roles? So now we have more roles spelled out. Well, okay, now we know what needs to be done by whom. Let's put that in policy. Now we have a policy component. We need to be able to measure that and monitor and make sure that's right. That's built into our improvement piece. So there's now a greater opportunity for us to go to leadership and talk about things like risk appetite and risk registers and alignment of the high-level organizational considerations for risk, and then all of the things that we still will continue to identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover from. It gives us that hook to be able to have discussions with the C-suite, the VPs, the board, whoever, to really make it real and to make sure that we're all rowing together to get to the right place.
Right. That's a great point. So now we wanted to take the next 20 minutes or so of the session and dive into the framework a little bit, into the core. So we're going to see if this works, if we can pull it up here. But as we do that, I think we're flexible to take questions and kind of have conversation as possible. If I know there's a microphone in the middle as we talk through this, we want to be able to kind of open up the conversation a little bit and talk about the changes. So let's see. Is there a way to get the URL that we've pulled up here on the screen?
Maybe.
Sir?
Phew, a question.
Hi.
When will what be updated? Well, I suspect it'd be the other way. I think the question was, when will the NIST special publications be updated? The publications won't be updated to reflect the CSF changes, but the CSF is being updated to reflect changes to the special publications. But I think what we will see is more frequent references to those different components. For example, if you work through special publication 800-37, which talks about the risk management framework for organizations and systems, it has many references to the cybersecurity framework. So I think over time, as these become formal and final at the end of the year, probably, I guess, maybe the beginning of 2024, those will then be able to be propagated out into other special pubs. So I don't think we'll see an immediate change in special publications, but I think what you will see is that all of the authors of the major NIST, at least the ITL, the Information Technology Labs publications, are reflected in here. We've seen that NIST is working to integrate. They've had the supply chain team reviewing and contributing, the privacy team, the ERM team. Many of their teams have contributed to this. So I think you will see that the cybersecurity framework reflects much of what's been done at NIST over the last 5 years. And as the subsequent editions of these documents are updated, I think that you'll see they point back to different pieces of the cybersecurity framework itself. Oh,
Talk through it.
okay. Well, I thought we could share it. I'm sorry, but we'll just quickly kind of talk through some of what was in the new core. Or did you have backup slides for that?
Just the side by side.
Oh, no, that's okay then.
Okay. Are they connected?
Oh,
Oh, perfect.
that'll work.
Okay.
Okay, we can't see it, but we know it.
Right. It's important that you guys can see it. Okay, let's see.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll zoom in a little bit. So starting off from the top here, I did jump down to page 6 here, so there is a lot of great material up front. Again, reading for the plane. That talks about some of the next steps, what NIST is working on right now, what they're really looking for feedback on, and also some of the examples. One of the other changes that is likely going to be incorporated into 2.0 is providing more examples on how to implement the outcomes of the framework itself. So back to that how are we going to do that? So all of that content is pages 1 through 5, great reading, but we are going to start here on page 6 and kind of dive into some of the details of the functions and the categories and the subcategories and some of the big changes and shifts that you'll see there.
Yeah. And actually, I'll draw on something Kelly was just saying. It became very clear from reading the various comments that came in, and everyone here is welcome to go look at the comments to the request for information and from the different workshops and things. It became really clear that people didn't actually read the words in the original prose. Now, the original cybersecurity framework, at least, was fairly brief. Compared to many of the NIST documents that have a lot of detail in them, the cybersecurity framework text is only about 30 pages. I jokingly said it's got fewer pages than the Cheesecake Factory menu has. It's not that big, and it's definitely not difficult to read. But clearly, many folks hadn't read it. So we will probably be putting, or at least seeing this put more text into the framework, but also just encouraging folks to please read that prose, because there's a lot of good guidance in there. And if people aren't reading the guidance that tells you how to use it, then there may be challenges with trying to apply the cybersecurity framework. So I would encourage everyone, there's not a lot of it there. Please do read the prose when the NIST releases that next edition of the framework itself. So I already talked a little bit about the govern side of it, and I think there's still quite a bit of discussion that will go on, maybe on the C-Forum page, but I think it's been a little bit of a moving target. We heard in some of the NIST workshops that I was fortunate to be part of that govern was something that would be helpful because, again, the risk decisions we need to make as practitioners are based on the guidance and the expectations of our leaders. So we need to know what those are. We need to have a strategy. And while the identify function always had a risk management strategy piece, it didn't include, it wasn't really as strategy focused as it could have been. So think about our strategy. So there's a highlight of that in the govern piece. There's a little bit more, in the past, you would have found roles and responsibilities kind of peppered out through the 5 functions. Now you'll see there's a specific section that specifically kind of pounds us on the head and says, you've got to figure out how you're going to do responsibility, accountability. Maybe you're building a RACI chart, whatever it might be, but figure out how you're going to assign these needs to which people so that you can make sure that we get it right.
Just following along with the document.
Oh, I'm following you.
Yeah. So, but yeah, like Greg was saying, and one of the things that I like about this document as you dig into it and start looking for what updates might affect your organization, it does lay it out and where things are moving from. So we can see in the kind of the first and third column where underneath roles and responsibilities, it says, formerly IDGV2. So it's really pointing you to this is where it's coming from and where we're moving to, and then breaking out all of those roles and responsibilities, the subcategories, into a more discrete way.
Yep, and if you look at those as you explore that rightmost column, you'll see that it kind of shows you that some of it used to be in identify, some of it used to be in govern, some of it used to be in detect. That's a reflection of the work NIST has done to kind of consolidate where things used to be more spread out. And I think it'll be interesting to see the feedback that NIST gets, because to some extent that was a feature. To some extent, many saw it as a bug. So we'll see. But that consolidation at least makes it clearer, and it puts it all in one place so that we don't have to say, well, okay, I'm talking about roles, but which one am I in? Now it lives together, so it's a little bit easier, I think, to apply it.
Yeah.
I think we'll find also one of the things that NIST has worked to do from what I've seen of this updated core was trying to provide a little bit more detail about what it means. Again, kind of feature and bug, but if you go back to the current edition of the framework, Cybersecurity Framework 1.1, one of the outcomes says data at rest is protected. What does that mean? That's part of how we ended up with the informative references in the first place. But people would come back to me when we were on a customer site and having meetings at a tabletop with their engineers. They'd say, well, what does that mean? What data? What do you mean by rest? What do you mean by protected? And we'd say, exactly. That's what you've got to tell us. That's what you need to figure out as a team. What data needs to be protected? What do you mean here? What do we call around here? Call data at rest. What do we consider adequate protection? Well, I don't know. And it got into this kind of a loop saying, well, what do you need? What do you got? What do you need? What do you got? And that's part of what these profiles were about. It's a way for us to write down, well, what do we do today with hard drives and thumb drives and written records? I worked with one customer where, filling out this exact profile, we said, okay, tell me, are you protecting your written records? Oh yeah, we put all of our important records in a filing cabinet in this big room with locks on all the filing cabinets. We said, great. And we walked in the room, we were actually passing through there to go to another meeting. I said, wait. Are these the filing cabinets you were talking about? Yeah. This public room that everyone walks through to get to your public conference room? Is that the room that you said is protected? Yeah. I said, these filing cabinets where all the keys are dangling from the locks in the cabinets? Yeah. All our sensitive records are in a filing cabinet with the keys dangling from the lock in a public room that any citizen in the country could walk through. Yeah, okay. Note to self, how could we record this in a profile that says our current state is we've done a really good job of aggregating our records, putting them in a place where they'd be relatively safe. We've got people monitoring who goes through this room. All right, from a risk consideration target state, maybe we could lock the door to the room where the filing cabinets are, and maybe we could even lock the cabinets. Food for thought, risk management. And of course, I'm not in a position to tell this customer what's adequate protection. But we can spark a dialogue and a conversation, and we can have a discussion at the risk profile level that says, okay, what are we doing? What could we be doing? What risks do we know jeopardize us? And are we doing enough? Could we be doing more? Should we do more? We don't want to do too much. To do anything beyond acceptable level of risk is actually wasting money and taking resources away from things we might really need it for. So we're not trying to say just drive as much as you can, but we are trying to say have a discussion within the team about what we could be doing and if whether what we're doing is enough. So that's why this profile model and that's why these outcomes are the way they are. And NIST has worked over the last 5 years, but especially over the last 5 weeks, to really try to think about what did we hear. There, at the workshop in Maryland, one of our colleagues, Matt Barrett, actually had days of workshop sessions where he stood at a whiteboard and said, row by row, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Good, bad, change, remove? What should we do about every single outcome in the 1.1 core? And that's where a lot of this feedback came. Besides your RFI comments, besides your comments on the concept paper, NIST was able to gather a lot of that information and try to work on becoming more clear, provide enough detail where we need it, but not so much detail that it handcuffs you. So I think NIST has done a pretty good job of finding that right balance, at least for the draft. Now it's your turn. Now it's your job to provide the feedback to help them understand, okay, a little too far, not quite far enough, maybe change this. I don't understand that word. This is where we get as a community. It's one of the cool things about the CSF, is it's a community framework. The community owns that framework. NIST's job is to write it down. So get to work. Sorry.
No.
Soapbox over here.
And so here, I do think they laid it out, back to really digging into the words and what's changed and what's moved. We can see, that's part of why we want to pull the document up, so you know exactly what you were looking for on your flight. Where all the categories and subcategories are and how to figure out what moved where and to be able to see the language side by side. And that was one of the nice things I think here, is you can read the new language that's being added and look at it right in context with the old language that was there and see, does this create more clarity? Is this actually confusing? And to be able to walk through it in that way.
Great. That's probably a good point to ask if there's any questions. I know there's been a lot of change there, so we could pause there and ask for questions if you want.
Yeah, I think definitely, if anybody has any questions, I think we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, so we'd love to answer questions as we continue walking through. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in how the new framework might be related to other types of frameworks or ways of securing it. There's a new
Uh-oh. Yeah.
It's also the one that I've shown. This was a nice general framework, but I chose for my organization CIS Critical Security.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Those are more specific in
Yeah.
the way to organize that. It's easier to implement, even though they are mapped together. So
Yeah.
do you have a mapping
Yeah.
of new framework?
Yeah. The question is whether NIST has provided a mapping of this new model to the many other types of models that were out there. That was one of the things that we heard frequently in reading the comments. A lot of the RFI responses said, please make sure you continue to map to others. And one of the examples was the great, I was talking to some of the folks from CIS just downstairs. There's lots of different types of frameworks, and there's lots of things that those do. That's part of what that online informative reference program will do, and maybe as they, NIST, I don't know exactly whether NIST will include that informative reference column or not. I suspect they will. But But there certainly will be more than they could ever fit into that column. So there will either be a combination or there'll be some combination of both. But one of the benefits of using the CSF, for me, as we've implemented at customer sites, CSF has driven discussion around that change, where the other frameworks, including NIST's risk management framework and the controls that NIST has released through the security and privacy controls in their document 800-53, you can use the profile, the target profile that you build through CSF, to think about how you would apply those other frameworks on what to do. So for example, if I went back to that data at rest is protected, and I'll find what the new phrase of that says, but it basically says the same thing, but with more clarity. But it basically, it gives us a way to have a discussion. Oh, here we go. The confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data at rest is protected. So it's a little bit further than what we had before in the old PR DS1. But even if we are using detailed criteria for post-quantum crypto encryption of data at rest, well, all the things we need to do and all the details. One of the things that's nice about CIS is that it's fairly technical, because it was built by people who do all the great work at SANS and Tony Sager work coming from IAD. There's a lot of detail in CIS that isn't necessarily suitable or reasonable to put in CSF. But what we can do is use CSF to say, what do we need to fix? What could we improve? Well, let's see what these other frameworks say we could do for that. ISO 27001 and 002 were just updated with more information. So we can take what we knew from CSF, say, we need to improve in this outcome. Okay, what does ISO say about that? What does CIS say about that? What do HITRUST and others say about that? So you can use this as sort of a Rosetta Stone to have discussions with leaders and managers and engineers about where do we need to make changes, or where are we doing great already? And then we can turn to those other standards, including the many great publications at NIST, to say, okay, how would I fill that gap? Or how could I improve to go from here to there?
Right. And I just wanted to point out here on the slide, we have all of our resources consolidated down into one, and that second resource is the online informative references. So if you are looking for those relationships and those mappings, that's where you will find that.
Yeah, and again, NIST is working to make those also machine readable, because it's getting to the point, if you look at NIST's Computer Security Resource Center, there's hundreds of publications, and they're all great, but many of those are hundreds of pages. So there's a lot to it. So by improving the way they can use automation and machine readable technologies to augment what we do in the pros, then that will help you get from here to there more quickly. So I think with that, as we start to wrap up, we've got just a minute left here, we wanted to talk about what you can apply coming out of the session today. So really next week, or really tomorrow on the flight home, you can read the document, but also know that the changes are coming, and start talking with your teams, with your peers, about what the changes mean to you and your organization if you're using the framework today. And start evaluating that. What do we need to do to prepare now that we have that draft, knowing there will be some changes, but things like the govern function, I think, are likely here to stay. And so we can start preparing for some of those. By summer, you should keep an eye out for CSF 2.0, the full document, the full framework, so not just the core. That will be coming out later this summer. And determine if, what kind of updates are needed to prepare for those changes, and who you need to talk to within the organization and within your groups to make sure nobody's blindsided. And please get involved. Really, we'd love to hear from you in C-Forum. We want to use this as a place to bring everybody together to talk about what's working, what's not working, what changes scare you, what changes you're excited about, and to be able to have that conversation. And then ultimately, when 2.0 is released, take a look at drive that implementation in your organization. A lot of these changes are reflective of the changes in the world around us over the last 10 years, or since 2018 for version 1.1. But you can really use that to make a difference in your organization and differentiate yourself by being proactive and prepared for these changes. So with that, we want to thank you all for joining our session.